Good afternoon and welcome to the final panel of this remarkable conference. My name is Jennifer Mason McAward. I am the acting director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is one of the constituent members of the Keough School. Most of our panelists this afternoon are heroically performing double duty at this conference. And so it's my pleasure to again introduce to you Tony Annett, who's the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Advisor at the Earth Institute and Religions for Peace, Archbishop Pedro Barreto, Archbishop of Huancayo, Peru, and Chair of the Department of Justice and Solidarity for CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, Dennis Jacobs, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Santa Clara University, Katherine Marshall, Senior Fellow at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown and Executive Director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue, Bernard Nahlen, the Deputy Coordinator of the President's Malaria Initiative, and last and not least, Mr. Kevin Clarke, who's joining a panel at this conference for the first time. He's the Senior Editor and Chief Correspondent for America Magazine. Goal 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals calls for global partnership among governments, the private sector, and civil society. Laudato Si calls for comprehensive solutions and new dialogue between politics and the economy, between religion and science. It's appropriate to end this conference by thinking about concrete steps that can foster these dialogues and operationalize these partnerships. I'm going to open by asking each of our panelists to briefly address what partnerships in the international community they view as critical to moving forward. And then I hope to use the remainder of our time to have a conversation among the panel and do some brainstorming to discuss goals and best practices with respect to what partnerships, in what areas, under what conditions, and how they will be the most fruitful. Why don't we start at the end of our table with Archbishop Barreto, just addressing briefly what he thinks the most critical partnerships will be moving forward in this age of Laudato Si and the SDGs.
Muy buenas tardes. Quisiera pedir que este conjunto de universidades se alíen, se unan a toda la dinámica que hay en América Latina, especialmente en la Conferencia Episcopal Latinoamericana, con respecto a la Amazonía.
Good afternoon. What I would ask in terms of a partnership is that the universities represented here and others unify and really join together in efforts to address some of the issues that we have in the Pan-Amazonian region.
La Amazonía no es solamente una zona geográfica de 7,5 millones de kilómetros cuadrados.
The Amazon is not only a geographic region with 7.5 million square kilometers,
sino que, como dice el Papa Francisco en la Laudato Si, es uno de los pulmones importantes de todo el planeta.
But as Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, it is one of the lungs of the planet.
Por tanto, tenemos una respuesta a este gran desafío a través de la red eclesial panamazónica.
And thus we have an answer to this great challenge through the ecclesial network of the Pan-Amazonian region that we have.
Que no es meramente una asociación de entidades de iglesia,
Which is not merely an association of church entities,
sino que es un tejido de apoyo en defensa de la vida y en defensa también del territorio.
but it's really a weaving together or network in defense of life and of the territory.
Hay muchos aspectos que las universidades católicas pueden aportar en esta dinámica de la red eclesial panamazónica.
And Catholic universities can contribute many elements to this REPAM network.
Y esta red eclesial panamazónica puede también ayudar a las universidades respecto al modo de trabajar ante este desafío que nos preocupa a todos.
And this network, REPAM, can also offer opportunities for the universities to join with us in responding to this great challenge that we face.
Y una de las alegrías más profundas que experimenté como arzobispo de Huancayo que está ubicado en el centro de los Andes del Perú,
And one of the great joys that I had as Archbishop of Huancayo, which is located in the center of Peru,
es la visita del cardenal muy querido en el Perú, el cardenal Teodoro McCarrick,
was the visit of Cardinal Theodore McCarrick,
arzobispo emérito de Washington, que ha sido el primer cardenal en la historia de la Iglesia que ha visitado la ciudad de Loroya, que es una de las 5 ciudades más contaminadas del mundo.
So McCarrick, Archbishop Emeritus of Washington, D.C., was the first cardinal in the church's history to visit the city of La Oroya, and La Oroya is the 5th most polluted city in the world.
Él es el prototipo, podríamos decir así, de lo que ahora queremos también de una sola iglesia en América, de apoyo, de comunicación, de diálogo, de escucha, para poder resolver los graves problemas socioambientales que vivimos en el Perú, en América Latina.
So we can say that he is a prototype of what I am searching for, what I am seeking in this relationship, in this dialogue, in this joining together of our efforts to benefit the area in the Amazon.
Y para terminar, decir que en la Amazonía viven 3 millones de hermanos y hermanas indígenas que son el modelo de cómo armonizar una relación solidaria, fraternal de las personas con la naturaleza.
And to finish, I would like to highlight that there are 3 million people who live in the Amazon who are really a model for how we can coexist and live together with nature.
Es la mejor universidad para aprender lo que Francisco quiere en este momento de armonizar el trabajo por el planeta y por los pobres.
And these 3 million really are the great university that can teach us how to harmonize and how to live together.
Tony?
Okay, thank you. I'll be very fast. I'll just speak very quickly and then we can open up for discussion later, because when we talk about partnerships, especially at the global level, there's a lot of dimensions we can take. And I want to start, as I always like to start, with the principles of Catholic social teaching, because I think when you talk about partnerships, you're really talking about relationships based on solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity in particular is the moral response to our global interdependence. And subsidiarity is the idea that we are all not just autonomous little groups, that higher order associations have a moral duty to help lower order associations to thrive, and that this associational life is vital for us as social animals. And so that's the little Catholic social teaching version of why these partnerships are so important in this goal. So we obviously need one, I would say, partnerships between countries. This is absolutely crucial. I mean, I think it's a duty of the richer countries to help the poorer countries attain sustainable development, get low carbon forms of energies, pay for the health, education, nutrition, energy, water, sanitation, all this stuff that's vital. And I think, key partnership is that the richer countries need to be able to do that. And as Jeff Sachs points out many times, this is not that expensive. In fact, I know, just take simple fact that moving to low carbon forms of energy costs like a little over 1% of GDP a year. Is that much? Well, global military spending is 2% of GDP a year. So yes, we have the resources, but do we have the will to do it? So that's, the partnership between countries. The second area is partnership between businesses, because as we know, sustainable development is not just a government agenda. It involves everybody. And especially for Catholic social teaching, businesses must be oriented toward the common good. Pope Francis says business is a noble vocation. But to be a noble vocation, it has to put aside this obsession with short-term profits and realize that it's actually part of society with broader responsibilities and duties to that broader society, which means it has a role in the common good. And there's a lot of issues involved there, but there's 2 issues in particular that Pope Francis mentions in Laudato Si', and that is one, by providing jobs and employment, which is much more than just income. It's about meaning, and it's about dignity, and it's about purpose. And 2 is about investing in sustainability, making sure that they internalize and pay for the social costs they impose on the environment. Pope Francis says that is how a business becomes ethical. is by, you know, making sure it's paying for the social costs it imposes on society. And we have to ask the question, how many businesses today are ethical by that standard? But that's important, and we need business. We need the creativity and ingenuity of business, but they must change their mindset. Then there's the 3 would be partnerships between religions. I won't say much in that, if other people can talk more about that, but that's absolutely crucial. We saw last year, not only with Laudato Si, but with the statements by the Buddhists, the Muslims, the Jews and the Hindus, all in advance of Paris, had a huge impact on getting the global community to come together on the very important Paris Accord. That moral dimension cannot be overemphasized. The 4th and final one I would mention is the kind of the academic, and since we're here at the university, universities are also vital for global partnerships. I work with Jeff Sachs at a group called the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network of, you know, global problem solvers at the local, national, and regional levels. And we can talk more about that if you want. But again, it's orientation toward the common good. And following up from the excellent panel this morning, I would ask maybe let's have a discussion on what is the particular role of Catholic universities in all of this, in these kind of global partnerships. For example, should, you know, Catholic universities teach have a more harmony between how they approach economics and business and Catholic social teachings? Too often we see economics departments and business schools over here, Catholic social teaching in the theology department over here, no dialogue whatsoever. That's a little bit of a problem. And we also have some issues where, unfortunately, I need to say, like, there's a lot of Catholic institutions that are, you know, beholden to certain libertarian interests. Not Notre Dame. Notre Dame is like ahead of the pack in this, but there are other ones there, and, you know, that's a problem. And if we want to solve these global problems together, we really need the moral weight of Catholic social teaching to provide the basis for this. And I'll stop there.
We won't talk about global football interests here at Notre Dame. I guess I've been invited to talk about how the press can be a partner in furthering sort of the vision of Laudato Si and taking advantage of this unique convergence of crises, really. It's an unfortunate convergence of crises with the ecological crises of economic justice, and how Pope Francis has come to sort of embody a vision towards resolving those crises. I think that the good news is, I don't certainly remember in my lifetime ever a papal document being received with the joy and the voraciousness that Laudato Si was received by the global press in June of last year. Pope Francis himself is incredibly popular. He has something like 10 million followers on Twitter, I think just his English language account. He has his Instagram account, which went live last week, I believe. I don't have Instagram, so I'm not sure. Was a record setter. It beat Kim Kardashian and David Beckham handily. First million followers in 12 hours. On Facebook, there were something like 200,000 conversations happening right now concerning Laudato Si. On Francis himself, there are hundreds of thousands of dialogues and timelines and comments on Facebook right now. So he's a phenomenon that he's loved by the global press. He's a cottage industry for the global press. Francis is a quote machine. You know, the guy he's putting more journalists to work in the last 5 years than any other phenomenon during a time of heavy job loss. So they even the guys who hate him love him because he gives them a lot to write about. So how do we take advantage of this, if you want to call it a partnership? I think the Keough School could do a lot toward helping journalists. I'm not going to say that journalists are lazy. They're not. They work very hard. But a lot of them are generalists. They don't have the depth of, certainly academic folk who specialize in area studies or specific disciplines, development studies. they don't have that kind of depth often. Not all of them, some of them do, but a lot of them do not, and they could use help. A lot of them don't understand the Catholic Church. They don't know what an encyclical is. Encyclical was probably used in June, if I don't know if anybody wants to Google this, June 2015. That's probably the highest time that the word encyclical has ever been floated out there in the media. So they need help understanding all of these things, and schools like the Keough School could help journalists. They could either through ongoing studies. Professor Marshall mentioned the idea of getting beyond the idea of just having 4 years or 6 years of study, but making study a lifetime opportunity, learning a lifetime opportunity. Well, journalists could benefit from that idea. I think if the Keough School, for instance, sponsored conferences just for journalists on things like, well, what is this encyclical? What is Catholic social teaching? What do you need to know about development, modern economics, and the impact on the third world of development policies? These would be greatly useful to journalists at a time when they are very interested in covering these stories. Maybe you could help get journalists out of their bubble. A lot of journalists are, like myself, are in an office. They don't get out in the field that often. You know, why is this conference happening here and not in Honduras, for instance, where you could turn it into a learning experience for all the participants? Even just a web page with a breakdown of key terms and turning the academic jargon that you guys are all familiar with, turning it into English that journalists can understand it and then use with their readership would be a great help. Other partnerships, at America Magazine, we have partnerships that are sort of indirect now. Social media is probably our biggest partnership, whether we acknowledge it or not. Sometimes I feel like all we do is chase after these latest Twitter or Facebook or what have you, but you cannot ignore the impact these entities have on viewership and readership. We used to get most of our new readers visiting our web pages via Google. That's not true anymore. 60 to 70% of them are now coming in from Facebook every day, except when breaking news happens and then they storm in via Twitter. So you have to be aware of these things and figure out how you can use them to your advantage. But I think beyond that, one of the great things about these social media entities is they allow kind of two-way communication that hasn't been true before. Certainly we get our share of trolls and, I guess retired Catholics who have nothing better to do except try to antagonize our editors. I think some of them are Tony's friends, I'm not sure.
Probably.
But there is also sometimes legitimate two-way communication. We get story ideas from Twitter all the time. We get leads from Facebook. People tell us, can you help us with this issue? And it turns into feature articles. So there's a kind of unique collaboration taking place now because of these social media entities that I guess it's moving towards something our church likes to talk a lot about, which is relationship, solidarity. It gets us journalists out of our bubble. We talk to actual human beings, and instead of pontificating to them or talking down to them, we have conversations with them. And that's the first step towards a relationship that makes this time a very exciting opportunity for all of us. Thank you.
So partnerships are absolutely essential to any endeavor, and certainly what the Keough School intends to accomplish could never be done without substantive, mutually beneficial partnerships. They also take a good deal of bandwidth in order to manage those relationships, and so one has to be selective about which partner institutions make the most sense, again, in a mutually reinforcing way. I think a strategic question the Keough School will need to address, and maybe it already has, is whether out of the blocks it will work sort of agnostically throughout the world, or whether it will pick particular regions or countries on which to start and to plant some roots. I think one of the challenges in developing kind of a robust set of programs that are largely field-based will be to have, again, substantive relationships and partnerships in that region. Those will have many dimensions, and I think Tony laid out what some of those dimensions are. Clearly, from an academic perspective, Notre Dame has great expertise in many areas, but will need to partner with intellectuals, thought leaders within countries and regions, and so to have strong academic partnerships would seem essential. And again, I think if one saw as an initial phase working in certain regions of the world, one could develop really robust relationships in those regions. As I mentioned this morning, I think one of the key solutions will need to sort of engage the ingenuity and creativity of the citizens on the ground, et cetera, and one avenue for doing that is to be partnering with social enterprises that really represent the values that we talked about through this conference. Tony brought them up again, values of really creating and supporting human dignity through employment opportunities, through thinking about the common good within a community, and being very attentive to the environmental concerns, both the degradation and adaptive approaches to helping communities become resilient to environmental change. That requires expertise and partnerships that really are quite regionally defined, and that, again, comes back to be a challenge if one intends to operate in all regions without having focus. There are wonderful entities that I think could be natural partners. CRS is one that comes to mind that has a very strong presence and is doing great work that can become a foundation to build upon. And there are many others, but I'll pass it to my colleagues here to continue the conversation.
I hope you can hear me. Partnership, I think, is one of the most used words in the fields of development, peace building, the environment these days. And to some extent, it's one of the most abused. So I was going to talk a little bit about some of the positives and linger for a minute or two on some of the less positives. First of all, why is everyone talking about partnerships? It's not a new concept. It's a very ancient concept that you can do things much better with other people or other institutions than you can do them alone. That's a bit of a no-brainer. But in these complex times where there are so many different sectors intertwined, and I think intertwined is the right word, because it's not just that they meet and mesh, but that they are tangled up in all kinds of ways. It's more important than ever to have these relationships that cross different lines. They open possibilities to basically to harness what the economists would call comparative advantage. In other words, to build to the strengths of different groups and institutions. And by doing that, to look to creative, bold solutions, to think beyond the boundaries that one gets stuck in when one is in a certain mindset, an intellectual discipline, a nationality, a type of institution, or whatever. We were asked the question, what's the most important partnership? I'm simply going to point to one of the big acronyms of the day, which is PPP, which is public-private partnerships. And there, what I want to emphasize is that however creative we get in thinking about partnerships, the importance of governance and the importance of the public responsibility is something we shouldn't ever forget. And there is a tendency to denigrate and to dismiss the public as hopeless. But I think the public-private partnership is an absolutely critical element. So why do eyes roll sometimes when we talk about partnership? Partly it's simply that it's overused. It's been sort of the mantra for many times, and therefore people sometimes lose sight of what it's about. But I think the biggest issue and the biggest danger is inequalities within partnership. And there's a word that comes up all the time in the field of looking at religious non-religious partnerships, and it is the word instrumentalize, which is one of these awful words that's been invented. But what it means is somebody using somebody else, or the sense that someone is using someone else. So if, for example, it seems like a good idea to have all of the imams in a country give a sermon on Friday about the benefits of hand washing, and they're simply handed that as an admonition, that's almost certain to generate negative reactions because they don't feel that they have been included and involved in the process. But I think it goes much deeper. I hear in many settings objections to the nature of partnerships, and particularly when money is involved, which it almost always is, and the sense that he who pays the piper calls the tune. In other words, that the foundation or the government entity or the business or whatever, whoever it is who has the purse strings, basically exercises too much power and really does not respect the gifts that a local community might bring or their skills. So I'll finish with just a little story from my World Bank days. I used to speak to all the new staff, and one of the things that I told them was that when you work for the World Bank, you come to a country, and we used to carry these large uniform briefcases. And the people who would meet you in a village or even in a ministry were pretty well convinced that the briefcases had money in them. And how could you get it opened, and how could you get access to that money? So the point was that people who come from outside are seen as bringing money. Now the people from outside, the bank or the fund or whoever else it is, what they think is that they're smarter than everyone else, and they come bearing ideas, and they come bearing inspiration, and people from universities often think this. And as you can see, you're set for some kind of a clash. What is important, and what these kinds of partnerships, what you're looking for in these partnerships is bringing basically knowledge of others and contacts and a web of connections that allow you to benefit and to learn. And unless you do it in that spirit of not of bringing, of giving money or giving even your talents, nor of being smarter and able to see things that people who are sitting there are not able to see, but being able to leverage, being the yeast, being able to generate both empowerment, whether it's men and women, or new ideas, new contacts. That is what is the essence of the search for partnerships.
Thanks. Well, it's hard to add much onto what you already heard. Actually, as Katherine was talking, I was just thinking many of you are probably familiar with the famous saying from Africa that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's what partnership is all about, because it is, those of us who've been involved in different sorts of partnerships, it is time consuming. It takes a lot of nurturing. It's not easy, but I think the results ultimately are much better than, may not be as quick as you want to see, but much better than just doing it by yourself. I'll just give one example of a partnership, because it's one I've been very involved in over the past, since it was launched in 1998, which was Dr. Gro Brundtland, when she came into WHO as the Director General, basically listened to the ministers of health primarily from Africa and Asia, and she took on malaria as an issue. So along with UNICEF, UNDP, and the World Bank, they launched what's called the Rollback Malaria Initiative. And that's been an interesting process. In fact, if anything, I would suggest that, there's lots written about partnerships, first of all, and some partnerships have been quite effective, and others, frankly, have either fallen apart, dissolved themselves, or continue but don't really do a lot. And I think it would be interesting, perhaps the Keo and others, to look at some of this, like what are the examples of partnerships and what can be learned from that. Hearing John Mira talk this morning about the effort to put global surgery and create capacity for providing access to surgery for people who don't access. One of the first steps is the right step, which is working with countries to put together a plan, because that then brings in some of the voices at the country level and some of the realities at the country level, and we all recognize there's no one-size-fits-all, and what may work in one country may not work as well in another. So that is the first step. I can tell you from the malaria perspective that countries had technically sound national malaria control plans for over a decade, but there were no resources to do anything. So it then becomes an exercise where you're just having meetings to plan, but there's no action. I think the Rollback Malaria Partnership, which is, it's not been a linear progression, there's been ups and downs, but it has been quite successful. If you look at and it's basically focused on three areas. One is advocacy for malaria, the second is resource mobilization, and the third is country support. To the point that, and a lot of what drove that was the call for malaria in the Millennium Development Goals, and of course now we've transitioned to the Sustainable Development Goals. But that was a big game changer when it came, that sort of level of focus at a global level to raise malaria. I mean, at a local level, people realized the problem with malaria, but at a global level, it was just seen as one of those big problems you couldn't do a whole lot about. It's been quite successful. The resource mobilization from many countries and from governments themselves has resulted in scaling up some of the tools we know. There was good evidence base that these tools would have a big impact. Systems were developed to get these interventions out to where they mattered, which was the poorest of the poor in very rural areas of some very difficult countries, to the point that the MDG report on malaria, which WHO and UNICEF and others put together and launched last September, showed that we did meet and exceeded the MDG for malaria. The interesting thing that's happened recently is and I should mention, there is I think part of the issue of a global partnership, because there's partnerships at different levels. There's academic partnerships, there's partnerships here and there, but the Keough School of Global Affairs, there are these global partnerships, and there will likely be some new ones which come along, and understanding why you would be involved in this partnership as a key player and maybe not that one is a discussion which the institution I'm sure we'll be having. And then once you make that decision, then what actually is it that you're going to bring to the table? So you actually become a contributor and not just a recipient of what others are doing. The governance of rollback malaria does include multilaterals, bilaterals, governments, ministers of health from affected countries, NGOs, civil society, private sector, research academia. But the same governance structure decided is an interesting, something which frankly I haven't seen happen with other global partnerships. They went through an evaluation in 2014, took that on board, and basically realized that despite the success, they weren't really fit for purpose going forward over the next 15 years, and the call for actually doing even more to actually get rid of malaria. So they did something which is pretty dramatic. They disbanded themselves, shut down their secretariat, and have now just set up a new board. In fact, there's a press announcement today, Kevin, the new board, which has just been put together. And we'll be setting up a new secretariat. And it's not because of the failure, but the recognition that just because of what you did now, that you can just continue to do the same thing. You need to challenge yourself and do something much more dramatic. So it's an interesting example. We'll see where it goes. There are some pretty major challenges when it comes to resource mobilization. I know that, and also new ways of bringing resources through tax revenue collections and this global financing facility for health and all sorts of other things. That's not my expertise, but I can tell you there's a lot of people looking at these things, not just for malaria specifically, but for health in general. I think the thing that makes a partnership successful is really an agreement on what is the mission. Because everybody is like the blind man and the elephant. everybody has an idea of why they might want to join a partnership, what they might want to do. But up front, if you have an agreement on what the mission is, then the question is, well, okay, how can you contribute to that mission? And we all recognize that different people can contribute in different ways. And that, I think, serves a big purpose in a lot of the confusion, sometimes tensions between different entities. It becomes much more manageable. And then secondly, it really is keeping your eye on the ball. What is it you're trying to do? Who are your clients? Partnerships by themselves is not a be-all and an end-all. It's really about keeping your eye on the faces of, in this case, communities, people who are dealing on a daily basis with a disease which has a big impact on their health and on their economic productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really keeping in mind what you're trying to do. And it's amazing when you can be in meetings and things start sometimes not look like they're going in the right direction. Once people see the faces of the poor and realize what they're trying to do, this really gets into, I guess, in some ways it's Laudato Si without realizing we were doing Laudato Si, which is for a disease that has a preferential option for the poor, malaria. The fact that this whole global community organized around malaria actually is focused on a preferential option for the poor has been a remarkable thing to be involved in. It's just one example. There's other examples in global health and I'm sure in other global partnerships.
Well, thank you all for those thoughtful comments. I'm hoping that we can have a conversation amongst the panelists. And to start that off, I'd like to actually throw a question to Kevin. You told me yesterday in your words that the media is a gateway drug to values.
I must have hit my head before I said that.
I thought it was a great phrase. And so I wrote it down, and I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the role of the media, and in particular faith-oriented media, in encouraging next steps and continued engagement with Laudato Si and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people have made the comment during the last few days that if these problems that we're facing in terms of climate change, social inequities are going to be resolved, we can't rely on a technological fix. Some people were, in fact, I thought, surprisingly pessimistic about our likelihood of resolving these problems before we're all swimming in the Atlantic. I think then if there is going to be a value shift, the media will be essential toward making that happen. We're swimming in a sea of media. I mean, I'm looking down at it. I'm just remembered a quote from Laudato Si that I wanted to quickly check on, and sure enough, I found it while this discussion was going on because I can access the media that fast here. So that's the great benefit of it. It's also the great danger because the quote I was looking for, which I've now lost somehow, was the Pope's concern that the media, in fact, is having the effect of, and the internet, of ruining relationships, of cutting us off from nature, of cutting us off from each other as we all get into our little self-contained bubbles of iPhones and laptops and iPads and tablets. Anyone who's rode a commuter train understands this when you get on it and you see all the phones come up and everyone is sort of like this. And that is definitely a danger that, and anyone with a teenager who spent 7 hours playing Warcraft with their friends, watching that happen in terror, you probably understand the idea that the Pope is getting at, that at what point does this start changing us as human beings? How far removed from ourselves and from our communities can the internet take us? And it is a confounding problem. There's so many different levels. There's so many confusing options now. At the same time, that kid that was just playing Warcraft, he might have been playing Warcraft with someone in India, or someone in Africa, or someone in England. So it does offer also that unique and really electrifying capacity to connect people in ways that just a few years ago were unimaginable. So as much as I share the Pope's concern, I think that this is also a great opportunity. If we can harness these entities wisely, we can do great good. And that's what I was mentioning before about being in dialogue via Facebook or via Twitter, as opposed to talking to people or at people when the media can not instrumentalize the people that write stories about it. In other words, just use them. I'm going to tell the story about the malaria victim, and then I'm going to move on to my next assignment. The people in the media I think a lot of them have a great deal of compassion. They want to get that malaria story out, not because it's a great story, but because they want malaria to be resolved. They want that problem to go away. And if we can maintain that compassion in our work, that's where it seems to me that the media becomes the gateway drug to that value shift, that change from the materialist enthrallment that we have in the first world to our junk, to our stuff, to our consumption, and the deprivation that afflicts the people in the developing world. The media can help move us to that value shift that we need, because we can't rely on technology. We have to change our behavior. So I hope that makes sense, some degree of sense.
Katherine, you had mentioned that partnerships are not a new idea, but I'm wondering if our panel might be willing to comment on whether there are particular substantive areas or particular regions, like for example the Pan-Amazon region, that might benefit from new sorts of partnerships in this new era of Laudato Si and the SDGs. Any thoughts on that?
Well, since the mic arrived in front of me, let me, I'm sure everyone. I think one of the interesting ideas at the broadest level on partnerships is, I'm going to attribute it to one of my colleagues called Jean-François Richard, who wrote a book called High Noon, 20 Global Problems and 20 Years to Resolve Them. But his basic point is that through conventional partnerships, sort of thinking about the WHO versus a national government versus regional government versus a company that manufactures X, Y, and Z, the sort of a traditional way of thinking about how you're going to address a problem, like the Amazon, for example. You need to think much more creatively, and given the nature of these problems, which sort of stretch into areas that we might not expect, you need to form partnerships around the needs of each of the issues, involving a very odd geometrical form of relationships. So I think that is, a very wise admonition to get outside of the sort of conventional bounds and to think much more creatively. So if it were the Amazon, actually one of the more interesting partnerships that I know on the Amazon is between Google Earth and the Fundación Avina, which basically is linking the capacity of Google Earth and to monitor with local groups on the ground, which can actually keep a much closer eye on what's happening. And you have, in some of the environmental dimensions, RED, for example, the avoided deforestation, you have similar, very interesting, there's a group of monks in northern Cambodia with GPS machines who are basically monitoring what's happening with illegal logging. So I think this idea of stretching our institutional imagination as we think about partnerships on these very big issues, but it could also be on small issues, is an essential approach.
Archbishop Barreto, you mentioned in your opening comments RAPAM, which is the Pan-Amazon Ecclesial Network, which is a transnational network of Catholic actors and institutions designed to protect the Amazon's peoples and environment. Could you tell us more about the role of the church in RAPAM and whether it's forming new types of partnerships outside of the church itself to advocate within that region?
Bueno, la REPAM es de reciente creación,
REPAM is a recent creation.
pero agrupa en todos los niveles, comenzando de las comunidades indígenas y de la presencia de la Iglesia en los diversos lugares de la Amazonía.
But it gathers the various levels, including the indigenous, or especially the indigenous communities, and the church's presence in the various indigenous communities.
En todo el territorio hay 110 vicariatos apostólicos, es decir, 110 obispos.
In the whole region, there are 110 vicariate districts, so 110 bishops.
Y el paso que se dio hace un año fue que el CELAM como institución acogiera como parte importante la red eclesial panamazónica.
And a few years ago, it was decided that CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, would take under its wing CELAM, the network.
Y a mí me eligieron como representante del CELAM en la red eclesial.
And I was chosen as the CELAM representative in the ecclesial network in Repam.
Y mi diócesis, arquidiócesis, no está en la región geográfica amazónica.
And my diocese is actually not in the exact region of Repam, in the Amazon.
Es decir, nos compromete a toda la iglesia.
So in one sense, it really commits all of the church to be involved with this.
El episcopado canadiense, el episcopado norteamericano se han sumado también a esta experiencia de la red eclesial panamazónica.
And the Canadian Bishops' Conference and the U.S. Bishops' Conference have gathered or have supported the efforts that we are having.
Y a nivel del Vaticano, de la Santa Sede, el cardenal Peter Turkson, el presidente de Justicia y Paz, también ha asumido un rol muy importante en la red eclesial panamazónica.
And at the Vatican level, Peter Turkson has also shown his support. The president of the Pontifical Commission for Justice and Peace has expressed his support for Repam.
Y por último, el Papa Francisco, en marzo del año pasado, nos recibió tanto al cardenal Claudio Humes, que es el presidente de la red eclesial panamazónica, como a mí, que era el presidente de Justicia y Solidaridad del CELAM.
And just last year, Pope Francis received Cardinal Hume and myself in the Vatican in our particular roles. And Cardinal Hume is currently the president of the Repam
Por
network.
tanto, la Repam es fuente de vida en el corazón de la iglesia.
So Repam is really a fountain of life in the heart of the church.
Más no podíamos pedir.
We couldn't have asked for more.
Y esto nos exige a todos a trabajar en 3 aspectos fundamentales que aquí en estos días yo he experimentado.
And this challenges us to work in particularly in 3 ways that in these past days I have experienced in this conference.
Una conversión,
One, that we need a conversion,
conversión ecológica, conversión amazónica,
ecological conversion, Pan-Amazon conversion.
y para ello hay como una convergencia muy importante en pasar del individualismo, de ser islas, como se decía esta mañana en las universidades, a ser verdaderamente una red que nos ayude a todos a reflexionar, a mirar, a escuchar, a juzgar y sobre todo a actuar conjuntamente.
And I believe that the Amazon can very much serve as a means of gathering and allowing us to leave our particular islands and to be able to go gather in around this topic, around this region, and to see, to judge, and to act appropriately.
Y la red eclesial panamazónica no solamente es la conversión ecológica o convergencia, sino también lo que se ha dicho aquí es adaptarnos a la Laudato Si.
And Repam is not just about the ecological conversion or question, but also adapting ourselves to Laudato Si.
Y estamos en esta dinámica eclesial y también de América, porque tenemos este privilegio de ser los portadores del 20% del oxígeno del mundo a través de la Amazonía.
And so we find ourselves in this ecclesial question at this time because we happen to be in a place that gives or contributes 20% of the world's oxygen.
Y por eso yo quisiera terminar con una, más que petición, es una oferta
So I want to finish not so much with a petition, but with an offer,
con bastantes descuentos.
with many discounts provided.
Es decir, que las universidades vayan y vean con sus propios ojos, con el corazón abierto, esta propuesta de la red eclesial panamazónica.
And it literally is that universities come, that they see with their own eyes and with an open heart what we have developed there in this Pan-Amazonian ecclesial network.
Y no vengo a pedirles dinero,
I don't come to
proyectos,
ask for money,
sino más bien ofrecerles la oportunidad de asociarse a este proyecto, a esta dinámica eclesial que puede ser vivido con entusiasmo, como el Papa Francisco nos invita.
I really come to offer you the opportunity to associate with yourselves with us to live into this challenge that Pope Francis presents.
Y por último es pasar del diálogo a la acción.
And lastly, to move from dialogue to action.
Una acción conjunta, una acción reflexionada y sobre todo dejándonos guiar por el Espíritu que está soplando fuerte en toda la Iglesia y aquí también en estos días que hemos podido compartir.
So a joint action, an action with great spirit, with the Holy Spirit that is blowing rather forcefully across the world, and here at this conference we have experienced.
Well, thank you for that invitation.
Yo puedo hablar más, pero
Would any of our other panelists like to talk or comment on ways to forge innovative partnerships that are either focused on regional development or on particular substantive areas that require creative work?
Okay, well, I don't know if this is helpful, but I think, as the bishop is saying, people need to go and to see, and we were talking about the media helping to change values. I do think any opportunities that the Keough School or other programs can create to sort of guide journalists, maybe moderate not quite a press junket, I'm thinking, but maybe something similar to that, but that is more of an educational opportunity, where they are taken to these regions where some of the crises that are being discussed in Laudato Si are quite poignant and quite obvious. That's how those stories will get surfaced. That'll come back into to our press, and maybe help prod some of our policymakers out of the bubble that they inhabit. Because I mean, how many of those guys ever leave Washington, or they fly back and forth from their home states to Washington, and there seems to me a disconnect to the reality of these problems, to the policies that are being made, and maybe journalists can help pop that bubble, but they need help learning themselves and seeing with their own eyes and with open hearts, as the bishop says.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I agree with something that Katherine said, because Katherine was many years at the World Bank. I was at the IMF for not as many years, but for long enough. And I think what Pope Francis refers to as the technocratic paradigm is the dominant paradigm of all international financial institutions and all international institutions. And a lot of these people do have great expertise and skills to offer, and that's good. But I think a technical paradigm alone is not going to solve problems, and it's very easy to switch to be tempted to go down a path that hurts rather than benefits. I mean, I'm always challenged by when Pope Francis talks about the poor. It's so different from the way a lot of the international development community talks about the poor. The international development community will often talk about how can we help the poor become less poor. But when Pope Francis talks about it, it's like, what do the poor teach us? And that's really hard for most of us who live in this part of the world to hear. But I think it's absolutely fundamental, which is why I think that Pope Francis' speech to popular movements in Bolivia last July was, after Laudato Si and Evangelii Gaudium, one of the most important speeches of his whole pontificate, because that was his rallying cry to the poor. And he's basically saying, you have the power to be agents of your own development. You have the ability to teach the rest of the world, how to live decent, flourishing lives. And just because you are deprived doesn't mean you lack dignity, because you do lack dignity. So I think, how do we form partnerships with the poor that recognizes their dignity? I think this is crucial for Christianity. I remember from my reading about the history, I love church history, I remember the medieval custom of when a rich person died or when a king died, they would find a few hundred poor people to light candles and march behind the coffin. And the reason was because there was the prevailing belief that God listened to the prayers of the poor rather than the rich. So the rich people wanted the poor people to pray for their souls. And we've kind of lost that idea that the poor are privileged by God. And we're in the great presence of Father Gutierrez here, who's devoted his life to that idea. But maybe, you know, that's something we need to consider. We who have been trained as economists and experts in, you know, in international organizations, a little bit of humility is where we need to start.
I'm happy to open it for questions from the rest of the room. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Well, I'm glad you've all solved the problem of how to create new partnerships going forward. This is great, yes.
Great, someone break the ice out there, all right.
Thank you all. To play off that last point, can each of you within your own organizations think of ways that your organizations or your projects might adopt an ethic of humility more fully?
Well, I work for the Jesuits. I don't know if that's...
Bueno, para mí lo más importante es fijarse en Jesús.
For me, the most important thing is to gaze upon Jesus.
Siendo rico se hace pobre, vivió en humildad,
Being rich becomes poor, lived in humility,
pero tenía un gran proyecto.
but had a great project.
Vayan por todo el mundo
Go across the
y
world
prediquen la buena nueva.
and preach good news.
Entonces, si queremos seguir a Jesús, tenemos que poner grandes proyectos, y el proyecto de Jesús es el reino de Dios.
So if we want to follow Jesus, we have to propose great projects, and the great project of Jesus is the kingdom of God.
Si no está Jesús, nos olvidamos de la humildad.
And if we take Jesus out of it, then we may forget a part of this humility.
I could add to that. I think one key lesson is stop idolizing wealth and people who have lots of wealth and assuming that just because they have lots of wealth, they have a privileged voice in solving problems, because that's not really true. I mean, wealth is obviously, you know, as Pope Francis says, you know, it's the idea that the resources of the earth and of human labor, we need a more just distribution of those resources. That's not just philanthropy, it's an obligation, and if you're a Christian, it's actually a commandment. So I would say that let's go back, as the Archbishop says, let's go back to Jesus, let's go back to the gospel, and really what it's all about. I think when we have a tendency in our society to, you know, our culture just idolizes wealth. From politics to, you know, entertainment to everything, and I think that's really corrosive.
I'll just say seriously to answer your question, I think what we can do as a media ministry is to treat people's opinions charitably and people's stories tenderly, and value them a little more than we do.
One of the most profound programs, I think, that exists at Santa Clara University takes place in El Salvador. It's a program called Casa de la Solidaridad. And students spend 15 weeks really accompanying those who live a very simple life. And in addition to some academic work, every day they are in rural communities and coffee farms, living the existence with a family, and understanding with great empathy through that immersion for how the other lives. And I think across the board, the students that return from that program return with a great sense of humility, a great sense of gratitude for what they received, as well as a sense of a calling of what they can do with their lives. And I think that program models for us the type of encounter and engagement that, as a Catholic university, as a Jesuit Catholic university, we would like to replicate for all of our students.
I seem not able to shed my World Bank identity today, but at one point in the World Bank, the president instructed that all managers would go spend a week in a village, which I found horrifying that they needed that. But the basic idea was that it was the actual experience of seeing how people lived that, and in some cases it was transformational. For others, happily, they really didn't need it. I worked in an agriculture program for years where we were constantly exposed to the realities of life. And I think the Peace Corps experience is really resulting in a generation which, a whole group, a cohort of people who have a deep sense of respect and caring. In a little bit more abstract sense, I find that the challenge of balancing a sense of human rights, which in many ways is very similar to the Catholic social teaching of human dignity, of making sure that the notion of rights and really thinking about it and thinking about what a rights-based approach means, at the same time that you don't lose the compassion that is the essential element of charity, that somehow you manage to avoid the paternalism that can go with charity, the sense of dependency, the potential even psychological arrogance that you're giving for your own benefit as much as for someone else's, but with that sense of caring and compassion, with what can be the more dry or legalistic, but deeply important sense of equality and potential, which I think is inherent in human rights, that finding ways to balance those two is an important part of the answer to your very good question.
Yeah, again, it depends on, organizations are also made up of people with different experiences, different backgrounds, so how someone can be humble or more humble is a big question, because there are people who, actually, it's interesting you mentioned the Peace Corps, Katherine, because I'm surrounded by ex-Peace Corps volunteers where I am. And I think what Peace Corps actually brings, that experience, is a sense of accompaniment. Because it's not like Peace Corps volunteers necessarily are, frankly, game changers at the local level, but it provides an experience of living and working hand in hand with people on a daily basis and really starting to understand what that's all about, that sense of accompaniment. There are other people I know in the world of development, whether not USAID, World Bank, who may have lived overseas in different countries for 20 years, but as they say, there's living overseas 20 years or living 1 year 20 times, because they never really seem to, it's very easy to isolate yourself and stay in the capital cities, lead a fairly comfortable life, go out on a little field trip here and there, but never really internalize a lot of what you're doing. So it becomes much more of a job as opposed to a mission. And I think I'm fortunate, again, to be surrounded by some pretty remarkable people who have had that experience of living and working in other countries in a very local, real way. Actually, I was struck last night by something Father Gutierrez said, which is, even the poor need a preferential option for the poor. So it's not like the poor themselves don't have some challenges when it comes to their own interactions. And I think our job as outsiders trying to support that is to make sure that whatever we do facilitates the development of relationships and issues in a way which, which are constructive and can move things forward, because we can do some real damage if we don't understand some of these local issues and what we're trying to do. And lastly, the other thing I remember Father Gutierrez said last night, I think he quoted Hannah Arendt, who said that, the poor are those who don't have a right to have rights, which I found very interesting. I never thought about that, because again, we tend to think of poor as a purely economic construct, as opposed to people who are marginalized. And I was thinking last night when he said that, I think many of us who lived through the early days of the AIDS epidemic here in the United States, it wasn't necessarily poor people who were being affected, but were people who were marginalized and who didn't have frankly, were not only not part of the political discussions around what was going on, but were ostracized from that. We're talking about groups that continue to have difficulties. So when we talk about poor, I like the concept that we need to think beyond. If we're trying to reach people at risk, there obviously lack of economic resources is one of the main driving factors of that and being voiceless. But there are other groups we also need to pay attention to. So I enjoyed hearing Father Gutierrez's reflections last night and thinking some about that.
We have time for one more question, which I'll turn over to Scott.
You've given us great advice about ways to build partnerships and constructive suggestions. I want to turn it around a little bit and follow up on Katherine's, I think, second set of points, and ask you, not all of you have to respond, but whoever has some insight into this, what partnerships to avoid? Let me give some context there. At the Keough School in particular, in one sense, we have, I think, a lot of possibilities to build partnerships. We want to avoid the error of not building enough. We certainly don't want to build too many, because someone made the point, important point, these partnerships need to be commensurate. I mean, that is, both sides really need to be committed, long-term, I think, in most cases, and be able to not have a subordinate relationship of one partner to the other. That said, we face some choices about what kind of partnerships to build. So I don't know that there are criteria necessarily, but what are your reflections on the prudential way forward in making selections of partnerships and who to partner with, what kinds of criteria, and in a way, what kind of partnerships to avoid, especially in our case, we're new, very young, and I worry about two things, not sufficient engagement and so much engagement that we drown and can't do our part in the partnership. So, please solve that for us now. I'll give you a couple minutes.
You want to talk about?
Well, it's a kind of an obvious point, and I know you wouldn't even dream of partnering with them, but since the question was asked as to who to avoid, I would say the fossil fuel industry. But that's actually a deeper issue than the simple, because it's there's the issue of divestment, which I know there are a lot of divided opinions of that. I am of the personal opinion that Catholic universities should divest from fossil fuels, because it's the wave of the future. It's just, if you read Pope Francis in Laudato Si, that these are the people masking the problems, concealing the symptoms, manipulating information so that their plans will not be affected. Pope Francis says that it's legitimate to organize boycotts of certain groups that work against the common good, and I think this is a clear example. But I'm sorry, I'm getting on my hobby horse, because I know the Keough School is not thinking of doing that at all. But I think in general, we just be very careful about some ties with business groups that often want to attach strings to partnerships, and sometimes those strings are not exactly strings that go towards the direction of the common good, if you know what I mean. And I'll get into trouble if I go any more, so I'll stop here. I think I'm already in trouble, but that's all right.
Yo quisiera añadir que esa misma pregunta que Scott nos hace, también nos la hacíamos hace 3 años cuando teníamos una asamblea panamazónica.
I would like to,
¿no?
I would like to add to the same question that Scott asks. We had ourselves as bishop when we were thinking about this Pan-Amazonian network.
Y en el fondo no queríamos ni asociación ni hermandad.
And ultimately, we weren't looking for an association, neither a partnership.
Y ahí nos propusimos reflexionar cómo podemos trabajar juntos.
And that's where we started reflecting how we could work together.
Y ante esta pregunta, ¿cómo trabajar juntos?, que es distinto a ver si hacemos una hermandad, surge la experiencia de una red.
And in the process of this notion of working together, which is not quite a partnership, emerged this notion of developing a network.
Y tuvimos 3 reuniones,
And we had
una
3 meetings,
en Quito, en Ecuador,
one in Quito, Ecuador,
después en Lima
then in Lima,
y después en Brasilia.
and then in Brasilia.
1 año y medio pasó.
It was a year and a half that went by.
Mientras tanto íbamos como buscando cómo
And during that time, we were looking at the question of how
la red eclesial va más allá de una hermandad.
the ecclesial network goes beyond a partnership.
La hermandad es ¿qué puedo yo ayudarte, Leonardo, no? ¿Y qué me puedes ayudar?
Sometimes a partnership can become simply, how can I help you and how can you help me?
La red podríamos decir que somos todos nosotros y cada uno va aportando y si le afecta a él, estamos unidos.
But with a network or a web, if something affects me and then it affects him, well, it affects all of you here.
Por eso yo estoy convencido que la red eclesial no es solamente panamazónica.
So I am convinced that the network, and in Spanish, network and web are the same word. So if this network or this this web, the Amazon,
Sino que es una inspiración del Espíritu,
it's really an inspiration of the
porque
Spirit.
la Laudato Si insiste que todo está conectado.
Because Laudato Si insists that everything is ultimately connected.
Y si todo está conectado en el mundo y en cada uno de nosotros,
And if everything is ultimately connected in the world and in each one of us,
¿por qué la Iglesia está perdiendo ese potencial de estar todos unidos?
why is the church losing this potential where we could all be connected,
En que no se pierde la autonomía de cada institución.
while not losing the autonomy of each institution?
Somos un cuerpo.
We are one body.
Entonces yo diría que hay que ir más allá de la hermandad.
So I would say that we have to go beyond partnership.
Hay que reflexionar y seguir avanzando.
We have to continue reflecting on this.
My advice to Keo, which won't be specific to the fossil fuel industry or any other industry, would be to identify what are the strategic objectives of having such a partnership. And so for that, you have to really look within, find what the gaps are that you're trying to fill, and approach the partnership as you look at potential partners. Again, with the idea of a mutually beneficial relationship in which you're very clear about what your expectations and what your commitments are going into the partnership, and vice versa. I think we've developed over time partnerships that have worked and that haven't. The best ones are the ones where both partners have been very clear on the front end of what would be of mutual benefit, and they've set those expectations up from the very beginning and then fulfilled those. It goes without saying, I think, that as it becomes more widely known that Notre Dame is setting up this new Keough School of Public Affairs, of Global Affairs, you will be approached by many entities that will want to partner. And so to be prepared with your own sort of strategic priorities of what you're looking for, I think will set you up well for conversations, which I'm sure many of them will yield great fruit, and others, there'll be a decision that a partnership really doesn't make sense in this particular case.
I'm going to give one of my classic answers, which is it depends. And clearly, it depends on the kind of partnership you're talking about. Are you talking about multi-year, complicated, where there really is a clear objective? But what was nagging in my mind as we were discussing and as you were raising the question is a lesson from the peace-building field and from others, that we really want to make sure that we're not just talking to the like-minded, that there is a willingness to reach out across the boundaries. And that means, in one obvious way, really seeing how the Keough Center can really benefit a very strapped and troubled poor university in another place, or in a very poor country, or how it can help it to resolve a crisis, or to consciously reach out to those who hold very different views of the world, whether they're religiously or in terms of worldview. Because I think we all are troubled by the tendency to be caught not only in disciplines, but also in intellectual and moral stovepipes. And in the world today, with the thing that keeps coming to my mind on the ISIS crisis and others, is the sense that there is so much we don't understand. That, and even in this country, we're caught by surprise with the Trump phenomenon. How on earth could this have happened? What is it that we didn't see? And if in our partnerships and our relationships, we're only hearing the voices that echo what we want to hear, I think we're not going to be able to address the big problems in the world.
Well, I would agree that a partnership with Donald Trump is probably one you want to avoid.
Are you being unpatriotic about our next president?
It'll be huge, yeah, it'll be huge. But I think, I guess the only thing I had to add is not necessarily what to avoid, but what to look for. And it really is that, and again, as people point out, there's different sorts of partnerships, but, partnerships, again, by themselves is not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily an end in itself. They take a lot of time. And it really is that, going back to this discussion from yesterday, see, judge, do. It's really the doing. Like, what is the action that partnership is attached to, and is there an agreement on how you're going to get there and how you're going to be able to show that that's been done? So it's like going into this with eyes wide open, but because otherwise it can take a lot of time and effort. And I've seen this. We've all been, well, maybe not all of us, but I've probably been in too many meetings where it's just planning the next meeting, and it's never clear where this is going. So what to look for is, what's the action? What are the expected outcomes? What are we trying to do? What impact is this? And what are we trying to benefit here? Because otherwise, it'll just be more meetings in nice hotels in different towns, and some people are satisfied by that, but none of us should be.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking my partners on this panel.